In 1787, the HMS Bounty, a British Navy vessel, set out on a mission to collect and transport breadfruit plants from Tahiti to the West Indies. Upon arriving in Tahiti, the crew had a 5-month layover. During this time, the men began to adapt and adjust to the culture and ways of the Tahitians. Many of them soon began to ingratiate themselves to Tahitian culture. The captain of the HMS Bounty, William Bligh, however, felt that such intermingling of cultures threatened crew discipline. As such, he began to hand out increasingly harsh punishments for such actions. Acting Lieutenant Fletcher Christian was a particular target. By 1790, he had had enough, and he and 25 crewmen mutinied, sending Bligh and 18 loyalists adrift. The mutineers settled on returning to Tahiti. Bligh, meanwhile, signaled the British Navy, which sent another ship, the HMS Pandora, to go find the mutineers and bring them to justice. The HMS Pandora apprehended 14 of the mutineers in Tahiti. However, the remaining mutineers managed to flee to a nearby island that to that point had been uncharted. When they arrived on the island, they could see that it was an ideal location, uninhabited, with plenty of food, water, and fertile land. As the mutineers explored the island, they discovered that while the island was presently uninhabited, it hadn't always been that way. In fact, what they found were the remnants of a lost society. This, students, is Pitcairn Island. Let's speak just a little bit about the geography of the island. Pitcairn Island is part of an area known as Southeast Polynesia, an area that consists of only 3 inhabitable islands: Pitcairn, Henderson, and Mangariva. More than 1,000 miles from the nearest populated islands, these 3 islands make up the Pitcairn Islands, or Southeast Polynesia, and it remains one of the most inaccessible islands in the world without any air or scheduled sea traffic, and visited only by the occasional yacht or cruise ship. In other words, residents of Pitcairn, Henderson, and Mangariva could rely on nobody but themselves. They could only rely on one another. There was no trade with other countries, no materials to build a ship with the potential to explore distant lands. These were 3 islands and 3 peoples whose fate was intertwined. Mangariva. This most abundantly endowed with natural resources, fresh water, available seafood, arable land to grow potatoes and yams, bananas, and breadfruit. In this way, farming and fishing and gathering of shellfish would have been able to support a human population of several thousand, more than 10 times as many as who could have survived on Pitcairn or Henderson. The drawback was that they lacked high-quality stone for making tools. This is Pitcairn. Fortunately, that deficiency from Mangariva was more than made up for on Pitcairn, which had an abundance of high-quality stone, including the largest quarry in Southeast Polynesia. In other respects, however, Pitcairn offered much more limited resources. While it did have streams and its forests included trees large enough to fashion into canoes, its small total area and general steepness meant that the area to farm was very small. Additionally, it did not have any beds of shellfish in the way that Mangariva had. Between limited farmland and a lack of shellfish, it could not support a population as large as Mangariva. This is Henderson. Henderson is the largest island, but it is the most remote and the most challenging for human existence. It is devoid of any rock for tool making. There were also no reliable fresh water sources. Even soil on Henderson is confined to small pockets, and the trees are not large enough to fashion canoes. Offsetting these disadvantages, though, Henderson does have attractions. In the shallow waters nearby, there are shellfish and a variety of other fish. There were also turtles and 17 varieties of seabirds. Mangariva, though largely self-sufficient, lacked high-quality stone to make tools. Pitcairn was so small it lacked the space necessary to support a large human population. Henderson was so ecologically marginal that we moderns wouldn't dream of going there even for a weekend without a chest full of resources, including drinking water. So while each of these islands alone couldn't truly support human life, when thought of as a unit, we can see that each had strengths that covered for the other's weaknesses. High-quality stone, abundant seafood and birds. In this way, though they were hundreds of miles apart from one another, They relied on one another totally. Let's chat about how they were intertwined. We'll start by talking about trade, we'll then talk about culture, and then we'll talk of what happened to the Pitcairn Islands. Trade. Archaeological excavations have uncovered extensive evidence of trade amongst all three islands, whereby each island's deficiencies were filled by the other island's surpluses. Numerous objects excavated on Henderson could immediately be identified as imports because they were made from materials available exclusively on either Mangariva or Pitcairn, such as oyster shell fish hooks, which would have come from Mangariva, and volcanic glass cutting tools, which would have come from Pitcairn. Henderson would have exported perishables such as sea turtles, which were considered to be delicacies amongst the chiefs in Polynesia. On Mangariva, excavations uncovered stone cutting tools which were made using the superior stone from Pitcairn. In short, studies have now documented a former flourishing trade in raw materials and possibly finished tools, in oyster shell from Mangariva to Pitcairn and Henderson, in volcanic glass from Pitcairn to Henderson, and in basalt from Pitcairn to Mangariva and Henderson. There were also crops traded to Pitcairn and Henderson. As Mangariva was the first of these three islands to be civilized, it would have represented an umbilical cord of sorts, essential for populating and stocking the new colonies. Culture. Even after Pitcairn's and Henderson's populations had grown to their maximum possible size, their numbers, about 100 and a few dozen, were so low that people of marriageable age would have found few potential partners on the island, as most of those partners would have been close relatives. In this way, the populations of these three islands were intermingling constantly and all the time. Let's start chatting about the loss of this relationship. Archaeologists have found that by 1500 CE, trade between these three islands had stopped. For Henderson Islanders specifically, we can only imagine how alone they must have been. Their trees were too small to make canoes, so they found themselves trapped on one of the most remote islands in the world. With no trade, they fell back on using the resources available to them in place of materials they would have traded for previously. In place of stone, they turned to shells of giant clams. For oven stones, they turned to shells of giant clams. You get the idea. They turned to giant clam shells a lot. They were using resources that weren't ideal. Struggling on in this way, Henderson's population managed to survive for a couple of more generations. But by 1600 CE, when Europeans visited the island, the population and civilization had disappeared. So what happened? Mangariva and Pitcairn fell to disastrous environmental changes. Population growth on both islands led to habitat damage and the mass extinction of plants and animals. With too many people and too little food, Mangariva and Pitcairn society slid into nightmares of civil wars and chronic hunger. For protein, people turned to cannibalism. Not only eating people just killed, but digging people up and eating corpses. All semblances of a complex political society broke down. With Mangariva and Pitcairn collapsing, the entire trade network broke down, as none of these places were able to sustain human life alone, and Henderson, an island, a society, a people, slowly vanished into history.